Little Rock, Arkansas. Spring 2002. The pale light of dawn stretched across the worn rooftops of a quiet, red brick apartment block on the city's south side. Inside a small second-floor unit, James Johnson sat motionless in a frayed armchair, his hollow eyes fixed on the glowing television screen. More than 2 decades had passed since the night his father, Reverend Luther Johnson, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a wound in James's chest that had never fully closed. Once, he had been a devout young man, full of faith and conviction, believing God was the light of justice and truth. But that night, the night his father never came home, the night his mother's desperate prayers dissolved into silence, his faith fell away, piece by piece, like autumn leaves stripped by wind. On the screen, a morning sermon echoed verses he knew by heart, but now those words only stung with bitter irony. He reached for the remote, ready to shut it off, when the shrill ring of his phone shattered the stillness. He picked up, and a calm, professional female voice came through. "Mr. Johnson, this is Detective Jennifer Miller, Pulaski County Sheriff's Office. I'm calling about your father's case. We've just uncovered some evidence that may be connected." James froze, his knuckles whitening on the receiver. "What are you saying? My father? It's been 25 years. That case is dead." "I understand. But this morning, a logger working in the Ouachita forest discovered an old Adidas duffel bag buried beneath a rotted oak stump. Inside, a pastor's robe and a Bible, both bearing Reverend Luther Johnson's name." The room tilted slightly as James tried to steady himself. 25 years. And now, the past had clawed its way back from the earth like a ghost refusing to rest. He heard his own voice rasp back, "I'll come." Hanging up, he looked back at the TV. The preacher on the morning show was still speaking about justice, about faith. James felt his lips curl into a faint, bitter smile. For the first time in 25 years, he rose, shrugged on his coat, and stepped outside. His heart beat faster with every unspoken question. Where had his father gone? Why? And most of all, who had turned him into a missing man? Outside his window, sunlight glinted off the steeple of Emmanuel Baptist Church downtown. The very church he'd sworn never to set foot in again. But today, everything was different. And as James Johnson walked into that new morning, he made himself a quiet promise. He would find the truth, no matter the cost. Around 7 a.m., a Pulaski County patrol car eased down a narrow dirt track into the Ouachita forest, the sun barely cresting the dense canopy of ancient oaks. In the back seat, James Johnson clenched his hands, eyes fixed on the fog-draped trees outside. He hadn't set foot in these woods since the summer of 1977, when he was a 17-year-old boy, pedaling his bicycle, aimlessly, hoping to see his father coming home from church. But this morning, he was back, to face the past he had tried so hard to bury. Detective Jennifer Miller glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You doing okay?" she asked, her voice calm. James gave a slight nod, his gaze unbroken. The car turned onto a narrower, slippery path covered in wet, decaying leaves. The deeper they drove, the darker and quieter it became. About 10 minutes in, the scene came into view. A clearing in the woods, cordoned off with yellow police tape. Forensic techs crouched on the ground, taking photos and samples. Nearby stood the massive stump of an oak tree, cut down years ago, its roots still burrowed deep into the soil. A burly man in a plaid workshirt stepped forward and extended his hand. "Daniel Cooper. I'm the one who found the bag." James shook it firmly, his voice low. "Can you tell me how?" Daniel nodded toward the stump. "Been cutting trees here for decades. This morning I was clearing out some old stumps to make way for replanting. This one, the soil just didn't feel right, like it had been dug up before. Took my shovel, dug down, and hit this old Adidas duffel, heavy and filthy. Opened it up, and..." His eyes flicked to James. "This wasn't just trash. Pastor's robe, Bible, with your father's name." At that, James's chest tightened. He drew in a long breath, willing himself to stay composed as he stepped closer to the stump. A forensic tech crouched by the hole and carefully lifted the bag from the square of disturbed earth. The fabric was damp, frayed, musty. The faded Adidas logo barely visible anymore. Detective Miller slipped on gloves and opened the bag in front of him. Inside lay a discolored pastor's robe and a black leather Bible, its edges worn. She gently handed him the book. James turned it over slowly, and his breath caught when he saw the handwriting in blue ink. Luther A. Johnson, Emmanuel Baptist, 1977. He knew that handwriting as well as his own. He flipped through the last pages, and a folded scrap of paper fell out. On it was a prayer, penned in his father's hand. Lord, help me stay strong. When darkness closes in, when the wicked try to pull me from your path, grant me courage. James's fingers trembled as he held the note, his vision blurring. The clearing around him seemed to fall into silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through the leaves. Detective Miller broke the spell. We'll send these items for DNA analysis. And, James, I have to ask, do you know anyone who might have wanted to harm your father? Enemies? Church conflicts? James slowly lifted his eyes, and for the first time that morning, they burned with quiet determination. This place, in 77, a black man leading a big church, wasn't something everyone was willing to accept, and I remember him telling my mother back then, something was wrong at the church, that he was investigating someone skimming funds. Daniel nodded solemnly beside him. I heard whispers. Reverend Johnson was a straight shooter. Someone definitely wanted him silenced. James turned to look at the stump again, at the freshly refilled hole, then back to Detective Miller. If they buried this here, they knew exactly what they were doing, and I won't let them get away with it. Not this time. A cold gust swept through, sending a few dry leaves tumbling into the hole. In that moment, James knew he'd set foot on a path of no return, a path of truth, justice, and faith. That afternoon, after the police packed up the evidence and cleared the scene, James sat alone on a weathered bench outside the sheriff's office, still clutching his father's Bible. One question echoed in his mind. If they could hide that bag so deep in the forest for 25 years, what else had they buried where no one dared to look? The sun was fading fast when James glanced down at his phone. Emmanuel Baptist Church still showed in his old contacts. His hand trembled as he pressed call. A young male voice answered, Emmanuel Baptist Church. How can I help you? I'd like to speak to the head pastor. Harold Carter? He's still there, isn't he? There was a pause. Yes, sir. Pastor Carter and Reverend Langley are here, but it's late. Maybe you can come tomorrow. James let out a faint, bitter laugh. Tell them James Johnson called. I'll be there tonight. He hung up, started his car, and drove straight toward downtown, without a second thought. Emmanuel Baptist Church loomed ahead, its steeple framed by towering oaks, a warm yellow light spilling from its frosted windows. James stood at the bottom of the steps, the weight of old memories pressing down on him. Sunday mornings packed with worshipers, his father's voice booming from the pulpit, fierce with faith, and the sharp, disapproving stares from some in the pews. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The sanctuary smelled faintly of polished wood. Rows of pews gleamed under the glow of stained glass, casting splashes of red, green, and gold on the floor. An older man turned from the altar, offering a polite smile. Can I help you, son? James's voice was flat. I'm here to see Pastor Carter. The man hesitated, then nodded. Wait here. Minutes later, Harold Carter emerged from the back hallway. He was older than James remembered, his hair white, his frame stooped, but his sharp eyes were unmistakable. For a moment, he froze, then forced a smile. James, my goodness, is that really you? It's been so many years. James stared back, unflinching. 25, since the night my father disappeared. The smile faltered. Another figure followed him out, George Langley, his eyes more shifty, his hands clasped in front of him. Harold quickly composed himself and gestured toward his office. Come on, let's talk inside. The pastor's office looked much as James remembered. Dusty bookshelves, crooked picture frames, piles of papers leaning precariously. Harold sat behind his desk, fingers interlaced, while George stood off to the side in silence. James placed the Bible on the desk, his voice low and deliberate. "This was found this morning, in the Ouachita forest. My father's robe and Bible, buried under an oak stump, and I want the two of you to tell me, to my face, what really happened here." Harold shot a quick glance at George, then gave a dry, hollow chuckle. We have no idea what you're suggesting. We grieved Luther's loss too, you know. But maybe he just walked away." James's jaw tightened. Walked away? Then buried his robe and Bible under a tree? And why, in his financial notes, did he write your names? With question marks? The air thickened. George shifted uneasily and looked away. Harold held James's stare, then slowly stood, his voice dropping to a warning tone. "You don't know what you're digging into, James. Best to let the past lie. Don't stir up old wounds." James shot to his feet, his eyes blazing with a mix of grief and fury. "Number not this time, not when it's my father." He turned and strode out, leaving behind the two old men, their faces drawn tight with unease. Outside, night had fallen, cool and heavy, but James felt something inside him burn, bright and steady. The looks of fear and guilt he'd just seen told him everything he needed to know. His father didn't vanish because he'd lost faith. Leaving Emmanuel Church, James didn't head home. Something gnawed at him, an unshakable instinct pulling him elsewhere. As his car rolled through the quiet streets, he glanced at the clock. Nearly 10 p.m. The only place he could think of now was the graveyard behind the church. There, rows of leaning headstones stood beneath the dark oaks, silent witnesses to a truth that had never rested. He parked in a bare patch of dirt, stepped out into the chill night air, his coat flapping in the wind. The old iron gate groaned as he pushed it open. At the far end of the cemetery, a faint beam of light flickered between the headstones. James slowed, pressing himself behind a tree, and watched. Then he saw them, Harold Carter and George Langley. The two men crouched low, hurriedly digging at a small patch of ground. Beside them lay a black duffel bag and a shovel. Their movements were frantic, furtive. For a moment, James felt the blood in his veins run cold. He took a deep breath, stepped out from the shadows. His footsteps on the gravel made both men spin around, startled. Their eyes met his, startled at first, then hardening into something more guarded. No words were exchanged. They simply froze, the shovel still stuck in the loose earth. James walked closer, slow and deliberate. His eyes dropped to the shallow hole, then to the black bag, which seemed to shift faintly, as though something inside settled. The air was thick, the only sound the wind hissing through the stones. James said nothing, staring at them in silence for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Behind him, the scrape of the shovel resumed, hurried and sharp. He didn't need to hear more. He had already seen enough, and he knew. Tonight, suspicion had become certainty. James drove away from the cemetery, but his mind was anything but quiet. The image of the two pastors digging under the beam of a flashlight cut through him like a blade. They weren't mourning, they were hiding something, or destroying it. He pulled off the road, lights off, and waited. Minutes later, their silver sedan emerged from the cemetery gates and sped north. James let them gain some distance before easing back onto the asphalt, keeping his own headlights dimmed. The night was thick and black. The mountain road curved higher and higher into the Ouachita forest, each turn darker than the last. His heart hammered as he kept their taillights in sight, far enough not to spook them, close enough not to lose them. After 20 minutes, the sedan veered onto a narrow trail that climbed toward the Eagle Rock lookout. James followed at a crawl, his gut twisting. He remembered how his father used to bring him up here as a boy to watch the Arkansas River wind below. Now it was the place someone else had chosen to bury the truth. He parked behind a bend, killed the engine, and crouched low, watching. The sedan came to a stop in the gravel lot. In the pale moonlight, he saw George climb out first, carrying the black duffel and a shovel. Harold followed, glancing nervously around. Both men slipped past the guardrail, descending the wooden steps to the overlook at the cliff's edge. James waited until they were out of sight, then eased out of his car, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last. The wind howled through the pines. The faint scrape of a shovel below carried back up to him. He peered down. The two men were working frantically at the edge of the platform, the bag half open. Even from here, he could see pale fragments, bone spilling from it. He heard Harold mutter, flat and cold, "Hurry. Toss it and it's done." James clenched his fists, pulled out his phone, and called Detective Miller. Her voice came on calm, crisp. "Johnson?" "Where are you?" he whispered, never taking his eyes off them. "Eagle Rock Lookout. They're about to throw something off the cliff. Hurry, I'm keeping my distance. Do not engage, we're en route." He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and leaned against the wooden railing, his gaze fixed on the two shadows below. His hands were still trembling, but his resolve felt like ice. Tonight, justice was finally moving, and he wasn't about to let his father be buried in silence a second time. The distant wail of sirens split the still night, climbing closer, louder. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, painting streaks of color on the dark mountain road leading up to Eagle Rock. On the wooden platform at the cliff's edge, Harold and George froze. Both turned their heads toward the sound, panic flaring in their eyes. George dropped the shovel, straightened up, still clutching the black duffel. Harold snatched it from him, his voice low and sharp. "We throw it now, before they get here." But James stepped out of the shadows, slowly descending the wooden stairs, his gaze locked on them. His footsteps landed hard and steady, each one cutting through the tense silence. The two men spun to face him, their faces draining of color. No one spoke. The wind howled through the pines, the sirens drawing nearer by the second. Then George cracked. His hand trembled, his eyes wet and wild. His voice broke as he rasped, I didn't want this. I didn't want to kill him." Harold whipped around, hissing, "Shut up," but it was too late. George dropped to his knees, letting the duffel fall to the boards, mumbling like a man confessing to God himself. We did it. We strangled him. Right there in the church basement. He was going to expose us to the congregation. We couldn't let him ruin us." James stood still, fists clenched so tight his knuckles bled, but he didn't lower his head. Not this time. Tires screeched on the gravel above. Detective Miller and two uniformed officers stormed down the steps, weapons raised. One barked, "Hands in the air! Drop the shovel!" George looked back at James one last time, his red eyes shining with shame, his lips forming a single word, "Sorry." Then he raised his hands, letting the officers drag him down and cuff him. Harold thrashed and shouted, "We just wanted to keep the church safe. You don't understand what he was doing." But the cuffs snapped shut on his wrists, all the same. James stood there, breathing in the cold night air, watching his father's killers finally being hauled away in chains. And in that moment, the darkness seemed to lift from the edge of the cliff, the wind carrying a faint warmth like a quiet promise that faith had never truly died. The next morning, James sat in an interview room at the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office. Pale sunlight filtered through a small window, casting faint lines across his weary face after a sleepless night. On the wooden table before him lay a bag of evidence, his father's worn leather journal and the 1977 sermon notebook, books Harold and George had tried to throw into the abyss along with the bones. Detective Miller stood on the other side of the table, gloved hands carefully opening the journal. The first pages were swollen and blackened with mold, but a few lines of ballpoint ink still shone through, defiant. James leaned closer, turning each page as though touching a living memory. Then he stopped, reading silently. April 8th, 1977. I can no longer ignore this. The missing funds now exceed $10,000. I confronted Harold and George. They denied everything, but the truth does not lie. I've prayed many nights for courage. This Sunday, if they do not confess, I will speak before the congregation myself." James gripped the book, feeling a heavy stone settle in his chest. Those words read like a final testament, brave and heartbreaking all at once. Detective Miller cleared her throat. "We now have George's confession, corroborated by the evidence. Both men will be charged with first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, embezzlement. Once DNA confirms the remains are your father's, you'll be able to lay him to rest properly." James nodded faintly. His eyes drifted to the sealed box holding the bone fragments, then rested on the sermon notebook with its faded cover. Luther A. Johnson, Emmanuel Baptist, Sermons, 1977. He opened it at random, reading his father's neat, slanted handwriting. When faced with evil, remember, God calls us to confront the truth with both love and courage, not to punish, but to redeem souls. James's eyes glistened, but for the first time in 25 years, a faint, weary smile broke across his face. His father, even in his final days, had clung to his faith, and now, at last, James was beginning to find that faith again, for himself. That night, James stopped by the hospital. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he carried a small box holding communion bread and a vial of grape juice, just as he'd promised young Robbie, the boy he'd found crying by his mother's grave. The pediatric ward was quiet, filled with the soft hum of machines and the faint scent of antiseptic. Robbie sat propped up on his pillow, looking better now, his cheeks flushed with some color, his eyes lighting up as soon as he saw James step in. His aunt and uncle stood by his bed, offering nervous smiles and a quiet thank you as James nodded and set the communion box on the bedside table. Slowly, he laid out the bread and juice on the tray, took a breath, and said softly, "My father used to say, you don't have to be perfect to pray. You just have to mean it." The room fell silent. James broke the bread, giving pieces to Robbie, to his guardians, and keeping one for himself. He poured the grape juice into little cups, pressing them gently into each hand. Robbie's gaze glistened as he looked up at James, seeing something warm there amid the chaos of his young life. James managed a faint smile, his voice low but steady. "Because God loved us first, we learned to love, even in the dark." Together, they bowed their heads. A prayer, unspoken yet deeply felt, filled each heart. When the quiet ritual was over, Robbie reached out and hugged James, whispering, "I want to grow up to be good, like you." James froze, then returned the embrace, gently. In that fleeting moment, he felt something in his chest ease, as though an old anger had finally let go. He left the hospital near midnight, stepping out under a sky full of stars. For the first time in 25 years, he felt light, and knew his father's faith, the faith he thought he'd lost, had never truly left him. And he whispered softly, as if answering his father, "I kept my promise, and I won't stop." A week later, the sky over Little Rock hung heavy with gray clouds as a quiet crowd gathered at the gates of Emmanuel Cemetery. Unlike that damp, secretive night when James had watched Harold and George bury their guilt, this morning felt clean and solemn. The day justice and memory were finally restored to a man who deserved them. A small oak coffin, draped in a pure white cloth, rested between two rows of wooden benches beneath a black painted cross. On top of the coffin lay his father's weathered Bible, the cover still bearing the name Luther A. Johnson, alongside a wreath of white lilies with a ribbon that read, "A pastor, a father, a man of integrity." James stood at the front, dressed in black, his eyes red but steady. He didn't cry. The storm of 25 years had passed, leaving behind a man strong enough to meet his pain head-on. In the back, a few elderly congregants bowed their heads in whispered prayer. Robbie was there too, with his aunt and uncle. The boy darted up to James, shyly pressing a white lily into his hand. James knelt briefly, ruffling the boy's hair with a faint smile. The young pastor at the pulpit began to speak, his voice deep and measured. He fought the good fight. He kept the faith. He finished his race. May his soul rest now in the peace of God. James closed his eyes, clutching his father's journal to his chest, as if to hold all the love and hurt of the past years together. In his mind, he heard his father's voice. When you can't see the light, remember. Faith doesn't need light, it just needs you to keep walking. The first shovelfuls of earth fell onto the coffin with a hollow thud. James breathed deep, lifting his head, his lips whispering, "I kept my promise, Dad." A soft breeze swept through, lifting the white ribbon on the wreath. A faint shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, touching the gravesite like a quiet blessing. That day, Little Rock laid to rest a pastor who had died for truth. And James buried the darkness in his own heart, ready to begin a new path, one where faith and justice would never again be buried. The next morning, James returned to Emmanuel Church. The old wooden door groaned as he pushed it open, his footsteps echoing across the tiled floor. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, painting brilliant colors on the empty pews. At the front, the pulpit stood solemn and still, the place where his father had once stood, preaching faith and justice. James walked slowly toward it, resting his hand on the cool wood, closing his eyes as though he could still feel the weight of his father's presence. In his mind, his father's voice murmured, "Justice is the hardest road. But that's why it needs faith." Behind him, the young pastor, newly appointed, stepped in quietly, offering a faint smile. "Mr. Johnson, people say, thank you for bringing the truth to light." James only nodded, saying nothing. He let go of the pulpit and turned to leave. Outside, congregants were sweeping leaves from the yard. Robbie darted about, laughing, and when he spotted James, he stopped and waved eagerly. "Mr. James, will you tell me more about your dad someday?" James crouched down, ruffling the boy's hair with a smile. "One day, I'll tell it all." He straightened and looked up at the pale blue sky. Inside, he felt light, as though 25 years of weight had finally lifted. Now, with justice done, faith rediscovered, and the truth finally spoken, he knew his father could rest, and he could begin again. James walked slowly toward the church gate, pausing once to look back, his eyes carrying a quiet resolve. Under his breath, whether to himself or to his father, he whispered, "I promise. I'll keep this light burning to the very end." The morning sun stretched across the narrow road as James Johnson stepped forward, disappearing into the dawn of a new chapter.